It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP and chair of the COVID recovery group, Mark Harper, the Labour MP, Rebecca Long-Bailey, the Daily Telegraph columnist, Tim Stanley, and the political editor of Politics Home, Kate Proctor. Today, the government says your country needs you.
Please do step up and roll up your sleeves and get protected.
But on the Tory backbenches, there are dark warnings about new restrictions.
This is a fundamental choice, I would say, between heading towards heaven and heading towards hell.
We'll ask the chair of the COVID recovery group why he couldn't support the government's new measures. Boris Johnson will be answering questions on this and more at PMQ's live at noon.
Get out, wake up, go away.
Police clear migrant camps on the coast while the French and UK governments still talk about talks. And Labour has a new band of frontbenchers. But in which direction will they take the party? Yesterday, we started the programme talking about people cancelling Christmas parties and events in the light of the Omicron variant. Let's take a look at the front page of The Guardian, which underlines the difference between the Prime Minister and one of his chief advisers. PM clashes with health officials over new curbs. Jenny Harries yesterday advising people to minimise their socialising over the festive period, which is beginning now. And Boris Johnson, who said in the press conference yesterday, there is no need to cancel your Christmas plans or parties. Where are you? Are you with Team Jenny or Team Boris, Mark?
Well, I think probably the public don't want to take advice about how to run their social lives actually from the Prime Minister or indeed from Dr Harries. But I think on a more serious note, it actually did raise an important issue yesterday, which is the government's got a very clear policy. It set out clear guidance, which the Prime Minister set out, which is that people should carry on with their plans. And Dr Harries...
Contradicting
and Dr Harries said something different. Well, no, the other way around. Dr Harries is an official, and I don't think ministers need to get a grip of officials. Shouldn't be going out contradicting the government's policy. Officials provide advice to ministers. Ministers make decisions, and the reason they make decisions is they have to balance a whole range of things. And no doubt we'll talk about that later. You know, that very damaging NAO report this morning, which highlights the difficulty the NHS has now got in coping with the consequences of lockdowns.
Rebecca, where were you with the advice from Jenny Harries, yes, an official, or Boris Johnson, because they said different things?
Well, it's very confusing, and that's kind of marred the whole governmental response to the COVID pandemic, quite frankly. But what we need to see from the Prime Minister and from government now is details on the science, that they're following as much information provided to the public as possible. And I think we need to be aware that with Omicron, we just don't know how serious this is going to be. We know that we passed a vote yesterday to introduce face masks in shops and on public transport, and I'm hoping that in weeks to come we'll find out that they actually weren't warranted, but it's right to be taking those cautious steps. But the confusion that was caused yesterday, unfortunately, it's already having a knock-on impact on the hospitality industry. So the government needs to be clear about what direction of travel it's going to take, what science it's following. If it is going to bring in restrictions on gatherings over the Christmas period, it needs to be honest and clear about that, and also set out the financial support that it's going to provide those businesses that are going to be adversely affected.
Tim, where are you?
I think both of them are right, in the sense that it's up to the individual to judge their own risks and make their own decisions about what they're going to do. Some people will judge, as Dr Harris suggested, that they should avoid social contact because they may feel with this new variant there's greater risk. Others will take the lead of the Prime Minister and carry on as normal. The reality on the ground, however, is that people are already changing their plans. They're doing so because of the variant and because they judge that it's something to be worried about, but they're also doing it because many, many times in the past, the government has said you can carry on as normal only to be told in some cases a few hours later that they've got to stop what they're doing and come home. So people travelled to Spain, people travelled to France, they were told they could go abroad, and then they were whipped back. And how many times has the government said these measures are only a small thing, we don't expect to go all the way, only for a few days later for them to announce something even stronger because, what a surprise, things have got out of control. So I think the reality on the ground is that people are probably following Harris's advice. But I think it's interesting that the Prime Minister is trying to stick to a classic Tory philosophical line of the government is not here to tell you what to do, but is here to give you information and advice so that it's up to you to decide. I don't think he's saying to people, I hope he's not saying to people, go out and go crazy. I think he's saying, you judge for yourself what you think is the right thing to do.
Right. Well, you've mentioned the Prime Minister directly. Let's have a look, Kate, with our viewers at the front page of The Mirror, which has a story. It's one rule for them. Boris party broke COVID rules. Now, this is about alleged parties, I think, actually, more than one, at number 10 last year, while the country was in varying stages of lockdown. Now, the story broke. Number 10 have said there were no parties. But do you think that's the end of it on this issue of potential rule breaking?
No, not at all. I think the government's going to be facing questions about this. These two specific events, they're supposed to have had about 40 to 50 people, one in November, one in December last year, and this is when one of them, at least, the one in December, was when London was in Tier 3. So they're saying that, you know, that COVID rules have been followed at all times, but just to give that one statement, I just don't think is enough, especially when people were interpreting the rules very strictly at that period in time, and they were, you know, often at home, and there were no parties to go to. Everything had been cancelled. And I think what they're using is that, you know, this is where it goes into a grey area. So if you had something that was for work reasons, then you could have a larger gathering. And I think that's the rule that they're going to be falling back, the guidance they're going to be falling back on. But I would just say, so key workers, let's say supermarket staff, they've been stacking the shelves all day, then they go in the back and have some drinks. That is a party, that's a Christmas event, and I don't think we'd think that was very fair. This line that, you know, work drifting into a party might be okay. I just don't think the public are really going to feel that that's a very fair justification. So I think they'll be facing lots more questions on this.
Well, you're absolutely right. There will be questions from journalists, I'm sure, all through the day. Let me just draw your attention to the front page of the Daily Telegraph. As we showed in the headlines, and Rebecca mentioned, new COVID restrictions to last until March next year. So these are new restrictions. They were passed in the House of Commons yesterday, but 19 Conservatives rebelled on the rule on masks and 32 over self-isolation. Now, under the new laws, people in England will have to wear masks in shops and on public transport. And in addition, close contacts of suspected Omicron cases in England will now have to self-isolate for 10 days, regardless of their vaccination status. Mark, you didn't support the government on these restrictions. You rebelled over the self-isolation ones. What's your problem?
Well, let me give you the two different cases. On masks, I set this out very clearly. I do think it's regrettable we've moved back to making laws about how people behave, rather than doing, as Tim said, giving them the evidence and the advice and letting them make their own decisions. But it does have a 3-week time limit. So on that basis, I didn't support it, but I didn't feel I needed to vote against it. On the self-isolation rules, as the Telegraph correctly says, they actually don't have a time limit. They run all the way until the 24th of March next year, which isn't really consistent with what ministers have said. It isn't consistent with just waiting a few weeks until we know more about this variant. And I fear that we're going to be back very quickly to the pandemic thing, where people who don't have COVID, have nothing wrong with them, end up being forced to stay at home, which, as we remember, big damage to the economy, to children's education, and to many businesses. And I just don't think that is a good thing to do, which is why I voted against it.
Right, just before I get your reaction, I'm just going to introduce Kelly Beaver, Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori, the market research company. She's going to be joining us for this discussion. But, Rebecca, your response to what you've just heard there?
I think I can understand the concerns that we could end up with these restrictions still being in place months from now, but I spoke to Professor Neil Ferguson this morning as part of a Science and Technology Committee investigation, and he was pretty clear that scientists would understand how virulent Omicron was, how transmissible it was, and how it was going to impact our communities by the end of this month. So I hope by that stage we'll understand what further restrictions or removal of restrictions will be required at that stage. But at this period in time, we just don't know. And I think we do need to protect public life as much as possible and also avoid the possibility of going into a further lockdown. And I think taking those basic public health protections now could ensure that we don't have to take stricter action in the future.
So look, two things on that. So look, I agree that we may know a lot more in 3 or 4 weeks' time, in which case there should have been a time limit on the regulations and then ministers should have come back. And picking up that important point on the time frame, it's the other reason why I've said that if the government learns new information and needs to make decisions when the House of Commons isn't sitting over Christmas, they must bring us back, share the evidence and get us to vote on it and not keep trying to rule by decree. This is about taking the public with you and being open and transparent. And I think that's how you make better decisions. And ministers still are resisting that idea.
Right, so you'd like Parliament to sit on the 20th of December?
Yes, if necessary, yes. Jo, as you do, many people in this country who earn a lot less than members of Parliament work during the Christmas period. And if members of Parliament need to do our jobs, to scrutinise and make laws during the Christmas break, so be it.
All right. Well, Kate, not that many MPs turned up for the debate yesterday. Plenty of empty spaces on the green benches. What did you make of that?
I think there's possibly a lot of fatigue and people kind of know which way things are going to go. Mark's group of MPs that come together on this, it's been quite a constant feature of the voting that you do have this group. And I would say, you know, it's really important that Mark's group of MPs do always make the argument that, you know, these regulations need to be debated. They need to come.
And
to
they
Parliament.
always do, don't they?
They do always make it.
It's quite good because no one else is doing it, Jo.
Well, there you go.
No, yeah. So you said you know you're a small group, but you do make the point very loudly, I think, every time. And I think you have a lot of, you know, pull with the public who feel the same. Can I just say quickly on masks? I think that I don't think it's a problem to be wearing masks. I would just say this particular set of rules feels inconsistent because you're supposed to wear them on public transport, but then not if you go to a Christmas pantomime and sit next to a stranger for 3 hours. I just think this particular set of rules is quite difficult to get your head round.
Tim, what did you make of the debate? You were watching it. As I say, far fewer MPs perhaps than might have been expected.
Yes, as Steve Bryan, MP, pointed out, at one point there was one Labour backbencher, one Liberal Democrat and one SNP.
Well, that was fair.
The only Tories who turned up in order to debate were actually against the government. And apart from the government minister, there was almost no one there in the Commons to explain the government's position and to defend the legislation, which is pretty extraordinary. Now, I find the Tory rebels' arguments very interesting because they get us into a sort of a philosophical debate. One argument they have is constitutional, which is that the government would like to govern by diktat. For instance, yesterday's debate was to a certain extent pointless, or at least the horse had already bolted the stable, because the measures had already come into effect at 4 a.m. They were debating something that had already happened. If the 3-week period for this all to be reviewed, as Mr. Harper's pointed out, will be over Christmas when Parliament is in recess. So there are constitutional objections to this. They're saying that things should be properly scrutinised. But there's also an interesting argument over the nature of freedom. As we leave the really intense part of the emergency of last year, and we begin to navigate the new world, what kind of post-COVID society do we build? Daisy Cooper, a Lib Dem MP, made the entirely coherent argument that although she is liberal and she's all for personal freedom, that stops at the point at which she might cause harm to others. But the most interesting speech was Steve Baker's, in which he said, the problem with that is that if you try to compel people to do the right thing, compel them to wear a mask, you're taking away their free will and their dignity. And are we going to create a society in which people do the right thing because government has told them to, rather than because they have been given all the information and they have been persuaded? So I want to stress the Tory rebels are not anti-vax, they're not even necessarily anti-mask. Their argument is really constitutional and philosophical.
All right, I'll get Mark to respond in just a moment, but let me introduce Kelly now into the discussion. You've been listening to this and what Tim has just said about people's freedoms and how they feel about it. What's your research shown about the public's attitude to their freedom or restrictions?
So just, look, we've been researching this now since February 2020 and the onset of COVID-19 in the UK, and I think we've consistently seen that the public are relatively cautious. They have been erring on the side of caution when it came to the restrictions and how they were broadly supportive of them in the name. I think one of the things that we've also seen is they have wanted government to take a lead on putting in place some of these restrictions. So at the beginning of the pandemic, public were quite against the idea of mask wearing, but that turned on a dime once the government came out with evidence about mask wearing and also asking people to do it and bringing it into one of the main restrictive pieces they wanted the public to be following. So I think there is an expectation from the public that government will take a lead. Other thing just to mention is the public are expecting a significant degree of turbulence as we come through the back end of, hopefully the back end of this pandemic. Half of the British people don't think that we're going to return to normal until after April next year. People were very concerned, 8 in 10, very concerned about the idea of another wave of COVID-19. Similar sorts of numbers were concerned about a new variant that was resistant to vaccines. So the public expect a degree of turbulence. And when we look at our questions that we ask them about how they feel about the restrictions, we are seeing broad public support for things like the social distancing measures and the mask wearing. Where we've seen a real shift in people's attitudes over the time that we've been measuring it is around the national lockdown, the closing of schools, and that is where we see less public support coming through now comparatively to earlier in the pandemic cycle.
Right, Mark, listening to that, do you accept then that your view or parts of what you think over restrictions, let's put lockdown to one side, don't chime actually with the majority of the public? They would like the government to take a lead. 71% support working from home, 68% support mandatory mask wearing in public places, 58% support banning all travel into and out of the country. So you're the outliers here.
Well, look, when we first started making the arguments we made last year, the public polling gap was much larger, and we made the arguments about having balanced decisions. And I think we saw this morning from what the National Audit Office published about the National Health Service, 240 to 740,000 people didn't get an urgent cancer referral last year because the NHS, for a period, turned from the National Health Service into the National COVID Service. And we not only had beds occupied by COVID patients, but we scared away a lot of people who were frightened to go to the health service, and we now see the consequences. So
although people might say more restrictions then.
What I'm arguing for is sensible, balanced decisions. And we're now in a post-vaccine world where we've vaccinated a very high number of members of the public. A lot of public now feel quite protected, and we've got to make sure we balance all of the risks that are there. And that's really what we're arguing for. Look at the costs and the benefits and make proper judgments.
All right, before I go to our other guests here in the studio, Tim, do you accept that perhaps people just aren't that bothered about their freedoms in that sense while this pandemic rolls on?
I'm pleased you asked that. The question is, if you don't mind me saying, is irrelevant from the point of view of an MP. The MP is not there to act purely on the basis of what a poll shows the public.
No,
wants.
sure.
Their primary job is to scrutinise legislation. They're rather like a lawyer. And sometimes they have to defend constitutional principles, even if they are unpopular. An analogous debate right now, for instance, is the fate of protest in this country. Now, most people do not like roads being blocked, etc. They'd like to see these people moved on, and they'd like to see tough government laws. They want to see the government take a lead, to coin a phrase. But there are constitutional principles which MPs have to consider. If I pass a bill saying it's easy to move a protester on, or if I pass a bill saying it's easier to push back an asylum seeker on a raft, am I undermining some broader constitutional or human rights position, which I'm obliged as an MP to consider? So that's the role I see these MPs playing. They are scrutinising and they're considering constitutional principles. Right. And I'm surprised that more MPs, be they left or right, don't do that.
Rebecca, where are you? In response to what Tim said, are you persuaded?
I think, well, the government's approach to COVID has been very authoritarian, and I had severe concerns with the original Coronavirus Act because it gave the government sweeping powers to put forward regulations and legislation without even consulting Parliament. And that wasn't right, when they should have been adopting a more public health orientated approach, because in the early stages, and this was something that came out in the Science and Technology Committee's report into COVID, the government adopted what can be described as a fatalistic approach in the early stages of COVID. They didn't think the public would accept a lockdown. They were worried about the damage that would be done to the economy. And they dithered and delayed and didn't take robust action quickly enough, which then resulted in where we are today, where we're in and out of lockdown. Nobody's really certain about what the future holds.
But Labour was in favour of lockdowns early on.
Far earlier than when the government government started to talk about it, unfortunately.
Right, so when you say it's been authoritarian, what do you mean? Are you in favour of the government upping the sort of measures that you would like to see or not?
I think you need to be proportionate. So, for example, yesterday, the passing of the regulations on masks, I don't think it's unreasonable to encourage people to wear masks where they're able to do so. Of course, there are people with medical conditions who can't do that.
That's always been the case.
But when we go into situations where we're talking about lockdowns, forcing people to stay in their homes, that needs to be done in a far more democratic way, and it needs to bring the public on side. And that's why I think it's so important now, before we start engaging in more authoritarian sweeping action, is to examine the public health actions that we can take now to avoid the government being pushed into a position where they have to look at these stricter measures in the future.
Yeah, should there have been more Labour MPs in the debate yesterday? Only one in the Commons debating this.
I mean, I can't speak. I know we had our front bench spokesperson there who spoke in the debate itself, and a number of MPs were in various other debates in Westminster Hall. But it was a very important issue to talk about. And
but no one was there, it seems, or very few.
No, I mean, and that usually happens within Parliament, where it's a piece of legislation where all the parties are in agreement that it's going to pass. You tend to have less of a robust discussion on the floor of the House.
That's the problem. I mean, Kate was saying this. Part of the reason why I felt it was important for the group that I chair of Conservative MPs was because, regardless of your views about the rights and wrongs of the measures the government's taken, I think it's really important in Parliament that ministers have to come to Parliament, set out what they're going to do, provide the evidence, be able to answer difficult questions and be challenged. That's the job of the Labour Party. The Leader of the Opposition, clue in the name, is supposed to do that. Even if he ends up agreeing with the government, he should ask tough questions. And on COVID, the Labour Party, front bench, has been nowhere. They just agree with the government, give them a blank cheque, say they'll agree to things before they've even seen them. And that doesn't lead to good government.
Okay.
And that's the role I've been playing with my group.
I think that's probably quite an accurate depiction of what's happening. And I think I mentioned fatigue earlier, and I think the idea that we all know what these arguments are, we've hashed them out, they've been thrashed out. You know, as a journalist, I could write lines for different people. I know what they are. But I still think that's a really poor situation to be in.
Right, yes, even with that preparatory work. Let me just show you, though, some of the things that are happening elsewhere in other parts of Europe, because if you look at this BBC News story, COVID, Greece to fine over 60s who refuse COVID-19 vaccine. Fines of €100 will be imposed at monthly intervals from mid-January on those who refuse. We can show you this on Germany's Chancellor-to-be, Olaf Scholz, backs mandatory COVID jabs. That's the same as Austria. I think they've got a limit in February that is going to come in. I mean, if you put all of that into perspective with what's going on here, we're not really talking about very much, are we, in terms of restrictions?
Well, just because other people are worse. I mean, just on the vaccine point, I mean, I'm a massive supporter of vaccination, but I do not think it should be mandatory. I think you should make the arguments. And our system of persuading people has been much more successful. We've got fantastic vaccine take-up, particularly amongst the most vulnerable groups. And
although the boosters were sluggish, weren't they?
No, I think we've got very good take-up of those. And I actually think the public health approach, which Rebecca talked about, which is you give people the evidence and you persuade them, actually gets you better outcomes than this authoritarian approach that some of those European countries have adopted, which I don't want us to follow.
Right, we're going to talk about the story in the Times. Priti Patel maps diplomatic tour of Europe to solve migrant crisis. We've talked an awful lot about this issue, about the small boat crossings in the Channel. This diplomatic tour comes on the back of being disinvited. Her invitation, Priti Patel's, was withdrawn by the French last weekend. It was a high-level meeting to talk about this very issue. So she instead is intending to embark on a tour of European capitals this week. We are also expecting a letter from the French Prime Minister, when I say we, the government, Jean Castex, today. We haven't seen or heard of it yet. Now, separately, the Home Office have sent out a press release to mark 1 year since the government's post-Brexit immigration system was introduced. And it says that they are delivering on people's priorities. Well, when you look at the situation with small boat crossings, there's something of a sort of tone deafness about that press release, isn't it?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. This is a complex issue. I think it's worth remembering the number of asylum seekers coming into the UK has actually been consistently falling for some time. What's happened is part of the reason why there are people coming in small boats is we've actually been fantastically successful in strengthening the ability of people to come illegally through the Channel Tunnel and on trucks. When I was in the Home Office, I used to be Immigration Minister, we put a huge amount of effort into that, and we've largely been successful.
Although your critics would say it's because there aren't any safe or legal routes outside a few
there used to be,
resettlement
but there used to be
schemes.
people coming through those routes, and that doesn't happen. I also think talking about solving the problem, as in there won't be anybody coming, is probably setting expectations wrongly.
Right, so delivering on people's priorities
This is a tough job, and you have to do a range of things, which the Home Secretary is doing. You work upstream with the source countries, and you set up schemes. So we do take people, as we did, for example, from Afghanistan, from the source countries. You disrupt the organised crime gangs, because that's who's involved in people trafficking. And then you do what she's also doing, which is you work with our European partners to set up agreements between all of us to head this problem off before it gets to the Channel
But so far,
coast.
none of that is working because people are still coming across in those small boats, and we had 27 people.
When you say it's not working, yes, there are people coming, but actually the number of people coming to Britain claiming asylum is actually
small boats
lower
across the Channel,
overall,
which is what Priti Patel promised to sort.
It's falling. There's more work to do on small boats. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary acknowledge that, and they're getting on with the job.
Kate, a Home Office source described Priti Patel to The Times as a headless chicken on a plane to whoever will speak to her. There's clearly quite a lot of hostile briefing, isn't there?
There is, and she is really suffering at the moment. She's been extremely popular, but at the moment her ratings are down, and she is at the end of some pretty vicious briefing against her. And I think that's probably quite strong, and, let's give her a chance. She needs to go out and meet these leaders and try and make some headway on what's a really difficult situation. But I would say, relations are so poor at the moment, and I think in some ways it is to do, I think, with Priti Patel's approach from the very beginning. We boasted heavily about our new immigration system, what it would achieve. That hasn't come out, and a lot of it is based on her Nationality and Borders Bill. That's yet to get its way through the Commons, and that's going to be subject to lots and lots of challenge over what some of the things are in the bill, especially relating to potential breaches of human rights. The Home Office would say nothing they want to do is illegal, everything's within the law. But I think Priti Patel has a lot of work to do to make much better relations with her European counterparts. The sense that I get is that she isn't a hugely popular figure abroad, because Britain, in terms of its immigration policy, has looked rather insular, and it's looked like it's obviously trying to protect its own borders. But in a European context, that isn't really what they want to see. We've also left the EU, so we initially have we have a diminished ability to make really strong relations, I think, with some of those counterparts and leaders.
And on that Nationality and Borders Bill, Mark, the Joint Committee on Human Rights, a group of MPs, have said that some of the measures, particularly denying people the right to claim asylum if they do arrive on the shores of the UK, however they got here, will be in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights. Are you comfortable with what's in that bill?
Well, I haven't read their report, and it was only published this morning, so I don't know what it says in detail. But I am broadly comfortable with the bill. I do think it's worth just saying, though, I think the bill will improve things, but it isn't suddenly going to transform things and solve all the problems. So I think there's a lot of hard graft to do, which is why I'm pleased the Home Secretary is getting out there, working with our partners internationally. You can't solve this problem purely with our own legislation.
Yeah, but the criticism is that it will actually be in breach of international treaties and laws.
Well, I don't think that's right. I mean, I think there were two things they said.
They're pretty clear in the research that they've done on that actually that is part of that convention, that if an asylum seeker, someone fleeing persecution, arrives in the UK, however they got here, has a right to claim asylum, which in the Nationality and Borders Bill, they will say they haven't.
Well, they still can claim asylum. We will determine the type of refugee or protected status we give them based on how they got here, and I don't think that's unreasonable, but we'll obviously see how it goes through Parliament, and I'll look at that report with great interest.
Rebecca?
No, I mean, even the Law Society said that the draft bill contravenes our international obligations for refugees. But, I mean, the situation that we see on the television, it's so harrowing, and we've got to remember that people are willing to risk their lives in search of a better life. And we've got to respect the humanity of these people. But the problem itself, it's so complex. I think there's not really any way around it without having real international collaboration. And that's not what we've seen from government so far. We saw Boris Johnson's letter posted on Twitter. We saw the French government angrily responding to that. That's not any way
the French
to engage
use Twitter all the time.
Yeah.
I just need to point that out.
Yes.
Well, I don't think it's any way to engage in international diplomacy, and it's not going to save the lives of these poor people.
No, but
who are
everyone would
dying.
agree with you, Rebecca, that the images last week of more people crossing the Channel after 27 people had lost their lives. I mean, they're terrible. But you talked in the Labour leadership contest about the country having a humanitarian response to asylum seekers and refugees. What is a humane deterrent? What does that look like?
A humane deterrent, there's a number of elements to this. So firstly, you don't want people risking their lives in boats.
Of course,
across the Channel.
but how do you deter them? As you said, they're prepared to do it.
You need to establish safe and legal routes so that people's asylum claims can be processed either in the country that they're in, trying to apply to Britain from, or within Britain itself. Then that needs to happen very, very quickly so that we don't have people languishing within our system here in the UK for many, many years without incomes. Secondly, we need to reinstate the Department for International Development, because you don't want to have refugees and asylum seekers in the first place. You want countries across the world to be stable, and you want to address the problems that cause those crises in the first place. And thirdly, we need to make sure that we have a properly resourced immigration system. As I say, we want to have proper investigations, we want them to be fast-tracked as quickly as possible, and we want them to be done in collaboration with countries across the world. And one of the problems that we've seen, unfortunately, since Brexit is that the Dublin regulations that the UK was part of had a collaborative working relationship. It allowed the UK to use the Eurodac fingerprint database to assess where...
It was only relatively successful, of course, Rebecca, in practice, that Dublin Agreement, because people used to dispute where the first safe country was for asylum seekers.
Nothing at all at the moment, nothing at all.
As part of our negotiations, and the European partners didn't want to go there.
Can I just pick up on one of the points that Rebecca made? Why is it no longer possible for a person to apply for asylum from a third country? I'm not talking about the resettlement schemes. There are very specific schemes for family reunion and for unaccompanied children, although, again, we can talk about the government's rejection of a proposal by the Labour peer Alf Dubs. But on the issue, if you are fleeing persecution, why can't you apply from a third country?
Well, when you said no
UK?
longer able, well, they've never been able to do that, which is why we have specific schemes. So we work with the UN.
But why can't you? Why can't you do that?
Well,
why shouldn't you be able to?
Well, we work with countries to put schemes in place where you can assess people's claims overseas. I did, when I was Immigration Minister, work with the International Migration Organisation. You assess people's claims, particularly vulnerable people. We did that with Syrian refugees, where we worked in the camps to identify people who were vulnerable, processed their claims, did all their security checks there, and then safely transported them to Britain. And we've just done the same with Afghanistan. And the Home Secretary has talked about...
I'm talking beyond that, because most of the people that do arrive in Calais have not gone through those sorts of things, but they are fleeing persecution.
Well, people in going in small boats are not fleeing persecution because they're coming from... hang on a minute. They're coming from France, right? So they're already in a safe country and they're making a dangerous journey from France. Now, that is the problem we need to solve with the French. And I thought the Prime Minister's letter, I read it carefully, very reasonable. And, you know, as Kate said, I think the French getting excited because he posted it on Twitter was an overreaction. And it's disappointing that they didn't have the Home Secretary at the meeting, because actually it's only by getting around the table with your partners that you can reach these agreements.
Tim, you've been listening very patiently, well, I hope you've been listening anyway, to the discussion here in the studio. In terms of this, the sort of nub of this whole issue, which is the deterrent, is how do you deter, how can you deter people who are perhaps fleeing desperate situations and perhaps others are just in search of a better life? How do you square this circle?
It's very, very difficult. What Mr. Harper said at the beginning is correct. In some regards, the British are a victim of success because they have done that. They've deterred people from taking certain routes. The result is that as you shut down unsafe routes, you've left people with the probably least safe of all, which is to cross the Channel. And then how do you deter them from doing that? Well, people talk about turning the boats back or simply rejecting people as soon as they arrive, but it is correct to say that people have a right to apply for asylum for the country they have got to, regardless of how they came to be there. And that's not just a narrow legalistic point, it's a moral one too. If someone knocks on my door and they are clearly bruised and bleeding and they say, please help me, I don't say to them, I'd like to help you, but it's important you go back to the first door that you knocked on. That's not a human response. So it's very difficult. I think what the government, what Priti Patel would like people to see she is trying to do is to make the situation tougher, but in some regards more generous. What I would like to see Conservative policy head towards is towards saying we will take more people, but on our terms, that we will sift between economic and political refugees, and we will not allow criminality. But at the same time, I wish that could be allied to a public campaign to make people less frightened about asylum. Because it should be borne in mind that you very often get waves of asylum in response to Western foreign policy action. So when there's a reason why lots of Afghans are now trying to come to Britain, right? The reason why lots of Iraqis have tried to come, there's a reason why lots of Syrians have tried to come. It's not always the case. There's a large number of Iranian asylum seekers, for instance. But this is not, they're not coming out of the blue. There's a reason why they wish to come here. There's a reason why they are on the move. And I think the West has to take responsibility for it.
Right. Would you agree with that, Mark? Take more people, but on our terms. Would that be one way forward?
Well, look, coming back to the point Tim just said there about international things, I mean, it's not right what Rebecca said, that we don't have a big international development budget. We are the third largest donor to countries to help with some of these issues upstream. And remember, most refugees are in the countries around the countries they're from, or still in country, and we put a huge amount of effort into helping those countries keep people safe and keep them in the region from which they come. And a relatively small number of people then leave those regions to come to
All right, but just to put it into
countries.
context, the House of Commons Library found that in 2020, Germany granted the largest number of positive asylum decisions among EU countries, and the figure for the UK was only just over 9,000, I think places it 14th. So the generosity can be put into that context. We're not the most generous by quite a long way.
No, but we're still a very generous country. A majority of people who claim asylum get asylum granted, which means they've got a good claim. And we've always made that offer to people, and we should carry on doing so.
Rebecca, are you pleased about Yvette? Oh, sorry, go on, Tim.
I was going to say that's one reason why the Europeans are angry with us. They think that we simultaneously don't work with others and are insufficiently collaborative and generous. But at the same time, they accuse us of having a very weak system internally, so that people are attracted to come here because there's a perception that they can get welfare. So for the view from outside Britain is very different to how many British people see asylum, which is they think we are simultaneously too soft and too stingy.
Right. Rebecca, on Yvette Cooper's appointment as the new Shadow Home Secretary facing Priti Patel, are you optimistic about that appointment, and will she be able to change the dial on this issue?
Yes, well, Yvette's very competent and capable. She's well known. She's very good performing within the media. And
what approach will she use? What approach do you think she'll use on this issue?
Well, I think it's early days. We'll have to wait and see, but I'm confident that she's spoken on this issue many times, that she will hold the current Home Secretary to account very, very rigorously. Right, by promising to do something more generous from the Labour perspective? Well, I haven't heard any change from our current position. And as I say, I think the main points that the party's been trying to get across is that firstly, we need safe and legal routes. Secondly, we need to make sure that we have international collaboration and we speak to French authorities particularly as quickly as possible and reach an agreement. And thirdly, we ensure that we invest in international development and overseas aid to stop these situations from arising in the first place. All right, well, let's have a look at this recent YouGov poll on how well the government is actually dealing with the Channel crossings. You'll see that it shows a general lack of grip in people's minds. 4 in 5 Britons disapprove of the government's handling of asylum seekers crossing the Channel. This is a real issue for you, isn't it, Mark? If you just look at those figures, 7%, only 7% of people and only 14% of Conservative voters think you're handling this well.
Well, I think the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary themselves have said that we've got more to do on this.
Well, not more to do. They just think you're handling it badly.
Well, I think they would accept that we're not doing everything we could do and that we need to do more, which is exactly why the Home Secretary is about to engage with some of our European partners and why the Prime Minister wanted her to be able to attend that meeting with the French, which the French didn't want her to go to, which was disappointing.
Right, Tim, how toxic is this issue?
Oh, hugely. Among the Tory grassroots, it's enormous. And it has helped to revive the career of the person who is probably the greatest danger to Boris Johnson, which is Nigel Farage. Whether you agree with him or not, he identified this issue early on, and he has used his programme on GB News to tell people about it. And as a result, he has really very effectively tapped into a well of discontent, which isn't just about asylum, by the way. It's also a referendum on, is Brexit working, and does the government understand what Brexit is really all about? Because there is a segment of Tory opinion that feels the point of Brexit was to take back control, particularly over borders. And they can see that that's not happening. And if you tie that into other things like trade deals, deregulation, tax rises, it all begins to create a picture of, yeah, Boris Johnson got Brexit done, but he doesn't know what to do with it.
Right. Let me just show you this net satisfaction ratings for the Cabinet. You mentioned Nigel Farage there. He's obviously not in the Cabinet. But in terms of people's popularity, you can see at the top there, Kate, Liz Truss. She is at the forefront, the Foreign Secretary. And if you look at the bottom there, Boris Johnson at minus 17.2. What do you make of it amongst Conservative members?
Well, that's really poor for the Prime Minister, and he doesn't want to be in that position at all. But I would say Liz Truss has had a bit of a gift in terms of the brief that she's had recently with international trade. It's allowed her to go around the world, do lots of photo shoots, look like she's getting things done very effectively. She's a lot of the deals.
She's quite good at her own Instagram account.
She's very good at all of that, and she has been able to give the success stories. You can debate how successful these international trade deals have been. Many of them are rollover deals, which I'm sure opposition politicians would point out. But she has presented a really positive image, and she hasn't been at the front line of the coronavirus response. She hasn't actually had to face some of these big challenges. So, yeah, she's riding high. But I just think, to be fair to the Prime Minister, he's had a lot more different challenges than Liz Truss has had.
Right, I wonder how worried he should be when he looks at this. It was a double-page spread, actually. There she is on a different front line, Liz Truss. It's the Trussian or the Trussian front, channeling her inner Margaret Thatcher. You can see the image there of her many years ago, also in a tank. Liz, the Iron Curtain lady. What's your response to that, Mark? Good for Liz Truss?
Well, look, I think it's good when the Foreign Secretary is out representing Britain abroad. That's what her job is. So I think...
And her own self-promotion for...
Well, no, representing herself abroad.
Look, she's abroad representing Britain, and that's her job, and her primary job is to sell Britain abroad, and I'm sure she knows that, and that's what she'll carry on doing. As far as the, tough ratings for the Prime Minister, look, it's been a tough few weeks, and the issue I had a slight falling out with the government on was on how it handled the standards issue, and I hope that there will be some reflection on how that was handled, and a bit of thought about, building some trust with backbenchers. Part of the reason why I was going on about, making sure Parliament's brought back if government makes tough decisions.
Lost your trust on that?
People with, well, on standards, I voted against the government's position, and then by the following day, the government's position had become the one I adopted. And I think I got that right. It's very important we have high standards in public life, and that's why I took the view that I did.
Rebecca, we wouldn't want to leave you out. We're going to talk about Labour leadership and, of course, the reshuffle yesterday of the shadow cabinet. I'm just going to play for everyone a clip from yesterday's programme with Andrew Fisher, the former Executive Director of Policy for the Labour Party, with his reaction.
I mean, look, I think the reality is, on the reshuffle, the left has already been marginalised within the shadow cabinet. There aren't, apart from Angela Rayner, who can't be removed, there's nobody kind of ostensibly on the left in there. This is very much now, as Sienna said, a kind of purging of the centre of the party, and it's very much in control of the right now. So that's what Keir Starmer wants. Clearly, it kind of dispels any lingering belief he wanted a kind of unity of all wings of the party involved.
Right, do you agree with him, Rebecca? Purge of the centre as well as the left?
Well, I mean, it's not unreasonable to expect a leader to want to have people around them that agree with their worldview and their possible vision for the direction of policy that they want to take in the future. But it's early days with this new shadow cabinet to see what direction it's going to go in. You can look at the key players and you can make assumptions based on the views that they've held in the past. And certainly, as Andrew said, I would say that they came from, a certain kind of entity within the party. But I think if we're serious, really, as a party about winning the next general election, we've got to be a united party. And even if we might have a shadow cabinet with a lot of people from a certain wing of the party, that shadow cabinet now has to reach out to the rest of the party and engage and use the strengths and ideas that we've actually got across the whole Labour Party and Labour movement. And that's what I hope's going to happen going forward.
What was your assumption when you saw the reshuffle yesterday and, as you say, a certain wing of the party being represented and not the other side?
I mean, I try not to pay that much attention, to be honest, until it all
Really?
comes out in the wash and we
Really?
see who's who and what's what. No, because everybody loves to know who's having a row with who in the Labour Party. But we need to be concentrating on policy now, and I think that's something that I hope the Shadow Cabinet, now that it's firmed up, will do.
Do you feel betrayed? I mean, John McDonnell tweeted in response it was a sort of Blairite revival, is what he said. You have said they've got to reach out to unify the party. Do you think Keir Starmer, in a way, duped you and others in saying it would represent his party, his leadership, all wings of the party, and now the reshuffle points in a different direction?
Well, he can have whoever he likes in his shadow cabinet. That's the kind of power that the leader has. But what he did do was stand on a platform of certain policy offerings that he was going to bring forward under his leadership. And I think the party now is waiting to see whether he's going to do that and honour the promises that he made. And it's, you know, we're not before a general election at the moment, but certainly when we do reach that general election, I think a lot of party members will want to be reassured, really, that a lot of the promises that were made when the leadership election happened are actually being kept, whilst also making sure that we've got the best, most exciting offering to put out before a general election.
I mean, some of those have been dropped, of course, already, as we heard at the party conference. Which ones would you like him to keep?
Well, one of the most important ones for me that I did quite a lot of detailed work on.
I'm so sorry, Rebecca. It's time to go into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions. I bet you're absolutely delighted.
A purple tie in recognition of the International Day of People with Disabilities this coming Friday. In July, we published the UK's first national disability strategy to help create a society that works for everybody. Mr. Speaker, I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with those continuing to face disruption caused by Storm Arwin. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, will update the House on the continuing response to Storm Arwin after these questions. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and I have a shared commitment to protecting our natural environment and improving our biodiversity across the country. Indeed, it's why I'm campaigning to extend the Chilterns area of natural beauty towards the southwest of Hitchin. Would my right honourable friend set out how he plans to strengthen the protections for our countryside, whilst also ensuring that housing developments are both green and sustainable for the long term?
Prime Minister. Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I can tell my honourable friend that Natural England is considering an extension of the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty, and I'm sure they will listen to his passionate appeal very carefully.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his words on disability and the victims of extreme weather? Can I also mark World AIDS Day? Extraordinary advances mean people living with HIV on effective treatment can now enjoy normal life expectancy and are no longer at risk of passing on the virus. It's within our hands to end new transmissions in the UK this decade. We must do so, Mr. Speaker. As millions of people were locked down last year, was a Christmas party thrown in Downing Street for dozens of people on December the 18th?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the right honourable gentleman is that all guidance was followed completely during Number 10. And can I recommend to the right honourable gentleman that he does the same with his own Christmas party, which he's advertised for December the 15th, to which unaccountably he's failed to invite the deputy leader, Mr. Speaker.
Nice try, but that won't work. Mr. Speaker, the defence seems to be no rules were broken. Well, I've got the rules that were in place at the time Prime Minister of this party. They're very clear, Mr. Speaker. You must not have a work Christmas lunch or party. Does the Prime Minister really expect the country to believe that while people were banned from seeing their loved ones at Christmas last year, it was fine for him and his friends to throw a boozy party in Downing Street?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've said what I've said about number 10 and the events of 12 months ago, but he since asked about what we're asking the country to do this year, Mr. Speaker, which I think is, frankly, a more relevant consideration. The important thing to do, Mr. Speaker, is not only to follow the guidance which we have set out, but also when it comes to dealing with the Omicron variant, to make sure that, as we've said, that you wear a mask on public transport and in shops, Mr. Speaker, and that you self-isolate if you come into contact with somebody who has Omicron, Mr. Speaker. And above all, what we're doing is strengthening our measures at the borders, but particularly, and I think this would be very valuable for everybody to hear, get your booster, Mr. Speaker. I know the right honourable gentleman is eligible for his booster. I'm not going to ask him, Mr. Speaker, since I'm forbidden to ask him questions, but I hope very much that he's had it.
Well, I can tell the Prime Minister I've had mine. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says we should concentrate on what he's asking the country to do. We're asking the country to follow the rules. Yep. Now, the Prime Minister doesn't deny there was a Downing Street Christmas party last year. He's not denied it. He says no rules were broken. Both of those things can't be true, Prime Minister. He's taking the British public for fools. And as for following the rules, Prime Minister, it might be good just to look behind you when it comes to the question of masks. As ever, one rule for them, another rule for everybody else. Mr. Speaker, at the last election, the Prime Minister promised to build 40 new hospitals. 40 new hospitals. Page 10 of his manifesto. With waiting lists so high, Prime Minister, it's a very, very important commitment. Now, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury have checked on progress, and it's reported that they've reached a damning conclusion. I know the Chancellor would have seen that. They've concluded that the project needs a red flag because it's unachievable. Prime Minister, is that true?
Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with... He plays politics and asks frivolous questions, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, and we're putting record investments into the NHS on top of the 34 billion with which we began, and then the 97 billion that we put in to fight COVID. We, Mr. Speaker, are helping to build another 40 new hospitals with an injection of £36 billion of investment, Mr. Speaker, which that party voted against.
Keir Starmer.
Well, this is strange, Mr. Speaker, because the government hasn't been denying the reports about the red flag, and they haven't done since, but now the Prime Minister does. There's obviously some confusion on these benches over whether the Cabinet Office and the Treasury think he's on course to break yet another promise, this time on new building of hospitals. So he can clear this up this afternoon. If he's so confident in his answer, why doesn't he publish the progress report in full and let us all see it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we're doing is not only building 14 new hospitals, but we are also, and it's incredible that we've been able to keep going throughout the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, but we're also making record investments in our, yes it is, and we're also making record investments in our NHS. We have more doctors, more nurses working in our NHS than at any time in the history of that magnificent organisation. And rather than running down what they're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, and casting doubt on their efforts, he should get behind them, and he should support our booster campaign.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there we have it. Prime Minister, I deny my hospital building programme has been flagged red as unachievable, but I don't have the confidence to publish the report. Mr. Speaker, the more we look at this promise, the murkier it gets. I've got a document here sent by the Department of Health to the NHS. It's called the New Hospital Programme Communications Playbook. I kid you not. It offers advice, Mr. Speaker, to make it easier to talk about the programme. Now, you might think that everyone knows what a new hospital is. I certainly thought I knew what a new hospital is before I read this document. But this guide instructs everybody to describe refurbishments and alterations on existing hospitals as new hospitals. We can all agree that refurbishments are a very good thing, but they're not new hospitals. So, Prime Minister, how many of the 40 are fix-up jobs on existing hospitals, and how many are actually the new hospitals he promised?
Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, you obviously don't always go around building on greenfield sites. What we are doing is massive. You rebuild hospitals, and that is what we have said for the last 2.5 years, Mr. Speaker. It is the biggest programme of hospital building this country has ever undertaken. It's being made possible by this people's government, and it's in addition to what we're doing with the community diagnostics hubs, Mr. Speaker, and it's in addition to what we're doing in investing in our NHS. And I said it once, but I'll say it again. They had the opportunity to vote for that 36 billion. They turned it down, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with the people's priorities. They're playing politics.
And no wonder so many Tory donors paid so much for that wallpaper last year. It probably told me it's building a new flat. It's the same old story from this Prime Minister, week in, week out, defending the indefensible and broken promises. His mates were found to be corrupt. He tried to get them off the hook. Downing Street throws parties during lockdown. He says, not a problem. He promised there'd be no tax rises. Then he put up tax. He promised there'd be a rail revolution in the north. Then he cancelled the trains. He promised no one would have to sell their home for care. Then along came his working class dementia tax. He promised 40 new hospitals, and even if you count the paint jobs, his own watchdog says he can't deliver it. Isn't this the truth, Mr. Speaker, that any promises from this Prime Minister aren't worth the manifesto paper they're written on?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman dribbles on irrelevantly about wallpaper and parties playing politics. And by the way, on that, I'm told that when the Deputy Leader and Shadow Secretary of State for the Future of Work was told that she wasn't invited, she denounced it. She denounced it as idiotic, childish, and pathetic. Mr. Speaker, they're getting on with factional. They're getting on with factional infighting. We are delivering for the people of this country. Today, cutting tax for the lowest paid people in this country. As a result of our universal credit changes, 1.9 million families getting £1,000 more in their pay packets this year. The biggest programme of rail infrastructure this century, Mr. Speaker. 3 new high-speed lines, and we're fixing social care. They have no plan whatever, Mr. Speaker. And don't forget, their resort to absolutely every problem is either to take this country back into lockdown or to open up to uncontrolled immigration, Mr. Speaker. That is their approach. We are delivering on the people's priorities, and we have more people in work now as a result of the balanced and proportionate approach that we are taking than we had before the pandemic began. And if we listened to him, Mr. Speaker, if we listened to Captain Hindsight, we'd all still be in lockdown. And that is the truth.
I want to hear to Mr. Rosendale. If you don't, come on, Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that we will not be able to stop the endless waves of illegal migrants crossing the English Channel until we break free from the constraints of the European Convention on Human Rights, which impedes our ability to tackle this tragic situation and protects even the most violent criminals from being deported. So, will the Prime Minister agree with me that it is time to take back control and fulfil our manifesto commitment in 2015 to get rid of Labour's Human Rights Act and bring in a British Bill of Rights?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, but we will certainly review the human rights system. But in the meantime, there is something we can do, or we can all do, on next Tuesday and Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, because our Borders Bill is coming back to this House after long gestation, and it gives us the power to make the distinction at last between illegal and legal migrants to this country. It gives us the power gives Border Force the power to turn people back from this at sea, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, it gives us the power. It gives us the power to screen people and send them for screening overseas rather than in this country. Now, will that I'm not going to ask them, I'm going to tell them. It'd be a great thing, Mr. Speaker, if the party opposite backed our Borders Bill and undermined the criminals.
The SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on disability, and of course our thoughts are very much with all of those that are recovering from Storm Arwin, and with the Leader of the Opposition. Of course, we commemorate World AIDS Day, and I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that the thoughts of yourself in this House will be with the family and friends of Siobhan Cathigan, the Scotland rugby player, aged 26, who unfortunately died over the course of the weekend, having had won 19 caps for Scotland. Mr. Speaker, it is deeply regrettable that once again that we're forced to spend so much time in this House discussing the Prime Minister's misconduct. But when the person in charge so blatantly breaks the rules, it needs to be talked about. Last Christmas, the Prime Minister hosted a packed party in Downing Street, an event that broke lockdown rules, rules that everyone else was expected to follow. Now, the Prime Minister might be denying it, but I've spoken to the Mirror newspaper this morning, and they are confirming what happened, and they have legal advice on potential illegality. At a time when public health messaging is so vital, how are people possibly expected to trust a Prime Minister when he thinks it's one rule for him and one rule for everybody else?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think they should concert their line of attack more closely. I've said before that he's talking total nonsense. I think he would have been better off, frankly, saying something about the victims of Storm Arwin in Scotland and what we want to do. I'm afraid if I didn't hear it, he was drowned out by his supporters. But I think what we need to do is work together, the government of the UK working with the Scottish authorities to help those people get their power back, and that's what we're doing.
Ian Blackford.
This graceful answer, and clearly the Prime Minister can't even listen because I mentioned Storm Arwin. Mr. Speaker, the real reason why all this matters is because we find ourselves at another very difficult moment in this pandemic. This is at a time where leadership matters, when truth matters, and when trust really matters. Only this morning, leaked sage advice confirms that the UK government's current international travel restrictions will identify significantly fewer cases. That is exactly the same advice that the Prime Minister received from the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales on Monday, and he has ignored that advice. Since then, other countries, like Ireland and the US, are moving rapidly on international travel to protect their people. So will the Prime Minister finally convene a four-nation Cobra meeting to tighten travel restrictions, or will he continue to ignore the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government and his own sage advisors and imperil the health of the public of these islands?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman, and of course we want to work closely with him, and there will be abundant opportunities today in the weeks ahead to concert our activity. But he's simply wrong in what he says about the steps that the government has taken to prevent the seeding of this variant from abroad. This country was actually the first to respond, Mr. Speaker, and for the 10 countries that are most likely to seed new variant, to seed Omicron in this country, we've put them on the red list, Mr. Speaker, so they have not only pre-departure tests, but they are also quarantined, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say that he is not right in what he says, and every other country in the world, 100%, I don't mind if he shouts, Mr. Speaker, I will tell him very calmly and quietly, 100% of the passengers arriving from every other country in the world must take a PCR test, and they cannot get out of quarantine, Mr. Speaker, unless they test negative. Those are balanced and proportionate measures designed to protect the British people from the Omicron variant, and that's the right approach to take.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, Britain has some of the most unaffordable childcare in the developed world, which reduces opportunities for working families, particularly single parents, deepens gender pay gaps, and makes levelling up much harder. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the proposal in my just published policy paper, Poverty Trapped, for an immediate review to design out these internationally uncompetitive costs, while still delivering a safe and enriching level of care for our children too?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend. He is completely right about the importance of childcare and the transformative influence it can have, and that's why we've spent £3.5 billion in each of the last 3 years on free childcare entitlements, particularly for the most disadvantaged. But I'm always happy to meet my right honourable friend and to discuss his ideas further.
Ed Davey.
Speaker, farmers across our country are crucial to our nation's prosperity, shown once again through the pandemic. But many are now on the brink. Farmers across the country in villages like Hodnett, Baschurch, Woodseaves and countless others are about to see their payments cut by at least 5% starting this very month. The Prime Minister promised a new support system rewarding more sustainable farming. Yet in the meantime, he seems prepared to see many British farms go bankrupt. There's an easy solution, Mr. Speaker. Stop cutting the current system's essential payments until the new scheme is fully rolled out. Will the Prime Minister do that and help our struggling farmers before it's too late?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think British Food and Farming does an absolutely outstanding job, and it is growing the whole time. Last night I met representatives of the UK food and farming industry, which we support and we continue to support with the same level of payments, Mr. Speaker. But what we're also doing is opening up new opportunities for them around the world, and I can tell him that in every single embassy now there is a dedicated expert on supporting UK food and farming exports to the rest of the world, which supports 4 million jobs in this country, and earns this country £21 billion of revenue.
Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More needs to be done to tackle the people trafficking gangs that exploit migrants across Europe, promising to get into this country. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that it is totally unacceptable that companies like Facebook allow those smugglers to offer their services on their platforms, not only routes into the country, but also selling them forged British papers in order to aid their access? Does he agree with me that when this House passes the online safety bill, we'll have the power to do more to make companies like Facebook take down content that promotes illegal activity?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right that too many of these gangs are using social media, and that's why the online harms bill is so important, and it will indeed be of assistance to us in taking down that kind of material.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women have been left with internal damage and pain that they describe as being like razor blades inside them. Many have lost their careers and some have even lost their lives. It is impossible to know exactly how many women are left suffering. So why will the Prime Minister not give these mesh-damaged women the redress that they were recommended in the Cumberledge report?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to her, and she raises an extremely important issue, and one that I know has caused a phenomenon that has caused huge distress to many, many women in this country. We published the Cumberledge report. If there's anything more that we can do, I'm certainly willing to look at it. I'm grateful to her for raising it.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
The levelling up agenda has already changed so many areas of our country for the better. And in my constituency, in Worksop particularly, our town centre is in desperate need of regeneration and to finally solve our flooding problems. But unfortunately, my council in Bassetlaw missed the deadline for the latest round of grants.
Labour on council.
What can this government do to help support areas like mine who have struggled with their bids in order to make sure they are successful the next time around?
I thank you I thank my honourable friend very much. Well, the step number one is to vote out those dozy Labour councillors, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell him and I thank him for the excellent representation he gives to Bassetlaw, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell him the second round of bidding for the Levelling Up Fund will open in the spring of next year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Between 2010 and 2019, West Midlands Police lost 2,221 officers, whilst the force should receive an additional 1,200 new recruits by 2023 via the Police Uplift Programme. That still leaves a shortfall of 1,000 officers. This lack of frontline police has left the force stretched and under significant pressure, with officers actually telling me there are simply insufficient resources to investigate every crime. Will the Prime Minister commit to providing West Midlands Police with a fairer funding deal to ensure the force can return officer numbers back to 2010 levels?
Mr. Speaker, I thank her for drawing attention, and I thank her. I thank the police officers in the West Midlands, but I thank her for drawing attention to what we're doing to increase the number of police officers, because we are on track. Of our 20,000 that I pledged on the steps of Downing Street 2.5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, we've already recruited another 11,000. And I'm proud to say that our police officer workforce is more representative of the whole of this country, with more women, more people from ethnic minorities than ever before.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, the Honourable Fabian Picardo, appeared before the European Scrutiny Committee and gave evidence about the continuing negotiations between Gibraltar and the European Union on their future relationship. During the course of his evidence, the Chief Minister made clear that his ambition was that Gibraltar's future should be, as he put it, British, British, British. Yeah. Can my right honourable friend say what the government is doing to support the First Minister to achieve that aim, and in particular to exclude any role for the European Court of Justice?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend, and frankly I can't really improve on the verdict of my friend Fabian Picardo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar. Gibraltar is British, 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 and will remain so. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I see no future role for the European Court of Justice.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Edinburgh West has some of the most polluted streets in our country. An estimated 1 in 29 deaths in Edinburgh is related to air pollution, and we don't meet WHO guidelines. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and discuss whether his government can support my private member's bill to tackle that issue, bring us into line and let us all breathe a little easier?
Prime Minister. I thank her for what the issue she mentions. It's incredibly important, but that's why we're moving now to all-out electric vehicles across the whole of the country, faster than any other European country. And our clean air strategy has been praised by the World Health Organization as an example for the rest of the world to follow. And we'll be setting out our evidence-based approach and the targets that we're setting. But of course, I'll be very happy to make sure that she meets the relevant minister to set out her case.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the drug company Pfizer announced a successful trial of a new treatment called Paxlovid. The trial showed the drug to be roughly 90% successful at stopping death or better. The vaccine strategy today is an enormous success, but it leads to a never-ending biological arms race against a mutating virus. As a supplement to the vaccine strategy, this treatment will allow governments around the world to avoid the need for future emergency restrictions. What's the government doing in the short term to secure supplies of this revolutionary treatment, and in the long term to enable factories to be built here to produce it in Britain?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and he's spot on. Of course, the rollout of Paxlovid within the UK, within the NHS, will depend on approval by the MHRA, but the government has, as a precaution, already invested in hundreds of thousands of courses of that drug.
Jessica Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wales has 11% of the UK rail network, yet only receives 2% of UK rail enhancement funding, and as reported in Wales Online, will be denied billions of consequential funding from HS2. So having under-delivered on rail in the north, having under-delivered on rail in Wales, why should anyone trust this government to deliver on its promises?
I'm afraid she's completely failed to look at what Sir Peter Hendy set out in his Union Connectivity Review, a fantastic agenda for change and improvement, particularly in Wales, and particularly on the North Welsh corridor, where I think the railway links deserve to be improved and will be improved under this government.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, getting investment into Gedling is important. And at the previous PMQs, I put aside my political differences with Labour-run Gedling Borough Council to champion its Levelling Up Fund bid, which, like other funding bids it's made, was sadly unsuccessful. So does my right honourable friend agree with me it's important that councils like Gedling now take stock and learn from this experience? And can you confirm that help from government will be available to do that, so that in future, hopefully, Gedling and other councils will be able to make more successful bids?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. We're very happy to help Gedling and other Labour-run councils to get their act together where necessary, and to put those bids in. And just to remind him, more Levelling Up Fund bids come due in the spring of next year, and I wish Gedling well in their future bids.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, my grandfather, along with thousands of others, came to this country 70 years ago, working 7 days a week in squalid conditions to help rebuild this country. Yet now the Home Secretary's Nationality and Borders Bill means she can revoke our British citizenship and deport us for even the most minor wrongdoings. Given the government's and the Home Office's horrific track record with their treatment of minorities, the hostile environment and the Windrush scandals, let me ask the Prime Minister the burning question that is now on the lips of everyone from a BAME background right across the country. When is he coming for me?
Prime Minister.
I think that the honourable gentleman opposite should look at the Conservative front bench today, and he should withdraw what he's just said, Mr. Speaker. He should withdraw it. What he said is absolutely shameful, and he knows full well the Borders Bill does nothing of the kind. It helps us to fight the evil gangs who are predating on people's willingness to cross the Channel in unseaworthy boats, and I would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that a sensible Labour Party would support it.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Saturday is Small Business Saturday, and I'm proud to represent some fantastic local businesses like Kays of Grantham, the Stanford Notebook Company, and the Bourne Bookshop. This government has provided unprecedented support throughout the pandemic. Can the Prime Minister assure me that his commitment to our high streets will continue long into the future?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for all the support he gives to Grantham and Stanford, and I can tell him that Small Business Saturday is receiving huge support from the government. We had a kind of festival last night to celebrate it in Downing Street, and I encourage everybody to get out this Saturday, Mr. Speaker, and safely with your mask on, Mr. Speaker, when you're in your shop. But that should be no inhibition on people buying in their shops up and down this country.
Final question, Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Next week, the 97th victim of the Hillsborough tragedy will receive the freedom of Liverpool. Andrew Devine passed away earlier this year, aged 55, having defied the odds to survive the injuries he sustained at Hillsborough, aged 22. A coroner's inquest in Liverpool in July ruled that he was unlawfully killed as a result of the disaster, making him the 97th victim. Following my tabling last week of an early day motion on Hillsborough and a national curriculum, Will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me to discuss the rollout of the Hillsborough Real Truth Legacy Project, including the addition of the Hillsborough disaster to the national curriculum, and help to consign to history the narrative of lies and smears peddled by some elements of the media and establishment over the last 32 years through the power of education?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for the powerful point that he has just made, because even though 32 years have passed since that devastating tragedy, I know that the wounds remain very raw in Liverpool. And what I can say to him is that the government is committed, as he knows, to continuing engagement with the families of the bereaved, and to making sure that the lessons from that tragedy continue to be properly learned, and that the victims of Hillsborough are never forgotten, Mr. Speaker. But I'm also happy to make sure that he meets the relevant minister to take forward an agenda I think is shared by people up and down this country.
We're now going to come to the statements. To those who wish to leave...
That brings us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's questions. There are going to be a few urgent questions on other issues which we may get to talk about today. Let me welcome my guests for this part of the programme. Alison McGovern for Labour, Shadow Minister for Culture and Sport. Chris Philp, Minister for Technology and the Digital Economy for the Government. And Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. Now, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, Laura, pressing the bruise of this issue of one rule for the Prime Minister and the Government and a different rule for everyone else. Ian Blackford did something pretty similar. He also talked about broken promises, the Labour leader, referencing on the broken promises 40 new hospitals, a pledge in the Tory manifesto, and whether that is actually going to be upheld. But let's go to the rules issue first of all. This is a number 10 boozy party. We talked about it at the very beginning of the programme. Reports about that party, which number 10 have denied, sort of. This is the front page of the Mirror here. It's one rule for them. Boris party broke COVID rules. I mean, this is important in one respect, because if you are issuing guidance to people with new restrictions, then the least you can do is adhere to the rules yourself.
Yes, and it comes at a moment where, while we're sort of in limbo around this new variant of COVID, being unsure about how serious it might be, you know, without doubt, certainly in the newspapers, and also families around the country are thinking, what might the impact be on people's plans for the next few weeks of their lives? And of course, that brings back memories of what happened last year, when there were weeks of promises from the government, and then suddenly that very, very significant about turn saying, sorry, after all, actually festivities are basically being called off. Now, in that context, that front page story from the Daily Mirror alleging that there was basically a traditional Christmas knees up in number 10 becomes something that was a political attack too hard to resist for the Labour leader, and then also from the SNP leader. And as you say, Downing Street have sort of said, well, there were no parties, but I think Boris Johnson's sort of non-denial in Prime Minister's questions was actually rather deafening.
Right. Well, Chris, has it been a denial about the number 10 party at Christmas last year?
Well, the Prime Minister was extremely clear in PMQs just a moment ago that rules were not broken, and that no one at number 10 did anything which contravened the rules that were in force at the time. But it's interesting to think back to last year. Why was it that we had that problem with Christmas that we thought was going to happen and then it wasn't? And the reason was that last year we didn't have a vaccinated population. Of course, this year the big difference is we do have a largely vaccinated population. And, of course, we're now rolling out the booster. We've got, I think, something like 17 million people have been boosted already, and we're now going to be boosting as many as we can in the coming weeks and months. So I would just say, if we want to make sure we can be free of any restrictions as soon as possible, if you haven't had a jab, please have it now. If you get invited for your booster jab, get your booster jab straight away. And that is our route through this. Let's just keep that in mind.
How do you think it looks, though, when there are images of a party that was held last year when the country was in varying stages of lockdown? The government may say no rules were broken, and there may be possible ways round, there may be loopholes that they have found in terms of what happens in offices and places of work. But how important is it that the government sets an example when they are issuing rules and restrictions to people?
Well, I mean, I have no idea what happened or didn't happen because if there was a party, I certainly wasn't invited to it.
Ah, well, I'm sorry about that.
Just to rub salt into the wound. But he's been very clear no rules were broken. So that is important, as you say. But what is most important isn't Keir Starmer trying to have some cheap dig. It's making sure that everyone who needs a vaccine and a booster gets one as soon as possible, because that is how we're going to save lives and that is how we're going to move beyond this difficult period of our national history.
I mean, Alison, Chris calls it a cheap dig. The Prime Minister called it frivolous. The questions were frivolous when we have far more important things to be talking about.
I think Boris Johnson is the last person to accuse others of being frivolous, if I'm honest.
Right, well, that may be so in terms of being competitive on this issue. But, I mean, if the Labour leader is asking questions about a Christmas party last year when the migrant crisis is ongoing, we're seeing a new variant spreading across the world, is it right that they focus on a party last year, whether or not it happened or whether or not it broke rules?
Yeah, well, look, firstly, the details matter because Prime Minister's questions is about interrogating the details. That's what accountability looks like. But this is part of a much bigger issue, and I think we saw that at Prime Minister's questions. This is about whether or not Boris Johnson can keep his promises to the British people, whether or not he is credible. And I think we had a whole host of events through the pandemic, whether it was Dominic Cummings or others, where people kind of lost faith a bit with what was going on, and that is the problem. Listening to PMQs, I know in my local area in the Wirral, we're supposed to be getting a new front to our A&E, and now I'm wondering whether that's going to be rebranded as one of these, new hospitals, when it will be nothing of the sort. That, Jo, I think drives cynicism in politics. That's why broken promises are actually a really big problem for us as a country.
Well, I don't think we have a broken promise problem at all. What really matters here is, in terms of COVID, is the fact that we had earlier this year Europe's leading vaccination programme. We invented the AstraZeneca vaccine in the country, funded by the government. We now have Europe's leading booster programme protecting our population. And you asked about promises on the NHS. We now have, even laying to one side the extra money for COVID, the 97 billion, we now have comfortably record amounts of money being spent on the NHS, more doctors and more nurses than we have ever had before.
Never mind money. Go and ask nurses about whether they've got enough staff. They'll tell you something different. However, on vaccination, right, we know this new variant has come about because of the situation in parts of Africa where people have been saying, we are not vaccinating in other countries enough. Where has the leadership been of the UK on that? Where has Boris Johnson been on making sure that we don't let other countries allow this widespread virus? So that's what's making mutations happen, which is terrible for those countries and is coming back on economic consequences for us. So don't come to me with this vaccination is such a success.
Well, first of all, vaccination in the UK is a huge success. We continue to lead Europe. But secondly, in terms of other countries, we are sending millions and millions, tens of millions of vaccines around the world, both directly and through our participation in the COVAX scheme.
Why is COVAX not delivered? Why have we got more broken promises in the global vaccine scheme?
To say nothing of the £10 billion in overseas aid.
All right, well, let's talk about the travel issue, since Alison has brought it up, talk about a different aspect of it, and that's whether or not the government restrictions that have been now introduced, these day 2 PCR tests if you're coming from outside the UK back into the country, and new self-isolation measures. You have to self-isolate until you receive a negative test. Is that enough?
Yeah, well, these measures passed Parliament a day or two ago with an enormous majority, so it commands widespread cross-party support. In terms of the substance of your question, clearly we've got this new variant. We're still trying to work out exactly how it compares to other variants. Is it worse? Is it not as bad? How transmissible is it? And how bad is it if someone catches it?
Sure.
So while we work through those important questions that we don't know the answer to, it's important to have proportionate and well-calibrated measures. And I think the measures that Parliament, I think including the opposition, overwhelmingly backed a day or two ago do strike the right balance. So from those red list countries where the new variant is rife, you've got to have a test before coming here, you've got to have quarantine, only UK residents, citizens can come back. But very sensible measures, proportionate measures to protect
Well, you say
us.
they're proportionate, but as you have just underlined, we don't know the full impact of this Omicron variant. We don't know whether it will escape vaccine protection, and we don't know how dangerous it is. On the basis of that, we've got these leaked minutes. The BBC has got them of a meeting of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE as they're known, and they are saying pre-departure COVID testing for travellers, not just when you get back to the UK, would be valuable. Is the government, and should the government be considering this?
Well, of course, for those red list countries, there is pre-departure
No, but they're just saying across the board.
So that is important. And for other countries, there is now the requirement to have a PCR test within 2 days.
But you could have been on a plane, you could have arrived in the airport, you could be mingling with all your fellow passengers, you could then get on public transport, travel to your destination, and you may have Omicron.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of things that might happen, OK? So we need to be proportionate and well-calibrated in designing measures that take reasonable steps to protect people without shutting down the whole economy. And that's why the balance was pitched where it was, and that is why Parliament, including the opposition, backed those measures overwhelmingly.
Yeah, I think we do need to take reasonable steps, and I think it's completely reasonable that people the whole time could have been wearing masks in shops and public transport. I think it's completely reasonable, Jo, as you said, to ask people to test before they come. I mean, you know, we're behind again, and I'm sorry to come back to this, but I do think Boris Johnson's own conduct in terms of mask wearing is a problem. You know, we've all got to just take, as Chris says, reasonable steps. Yeah, come on, let's be reasonable. Let's put our masks on. Let's do the things that we can do to stop the spread.
Right. In terms of being proportionate and balanced about these things, it's very difficult for all sides to know where to strike that, particularly with this issue of something we don't yet know much about.
That's right, and there's a real sense that actually the government is in a very uncomfortable limbo here, of course, and let's hope this is not the case. But if it turns out that Omicron is a truly deadly variant, that it does spread at a terrifying rate, and let's hope that is not the case, then it may well be in a few weeks' time that the measures the government's taken this week look like they were too flimsy, look like they didn't go too far. If, on the other hand, as I'm sure all our viewers hope, it's proven that Omicron is not a terribly destructive variant, that it is not something that's going to tear through the country at an alarming rate and cause lots of harm and hospitalisations, well then, some people might think, well, did we actually have to start bringing in these kinds of extra hassles for travellers, for example? Because that is how some people will see it. The point is, it is both a genuine policy dilemma, but also a political dilemma, because there are Conservative backbenchers who will say, you know, bringing back restrictions of any kind could be terrible for the economy. And then, of course, you've got the opposition parties who, quite understandably from their logic, well, as Alison has been saying that's not enough. And the government won't be able to know, perhaps for another fortnight, which side their decision-making will be proven to have come down on. And it's this sort of classic COVID dilemma, actually, frankly, Jo, that we've seen all the way through. The government, as governments around the world are doing, are trying to deal with something unprecedented that nobody can really predict.
We do have the vaccine rollout. So one thing
Indeed,
different
it's a very
this year
different situation to last year.
Is the vaccines and the boosters. That can make a real difference,
Indeed,
I think.
But the threat, of course, as our viewers well know from Omicron, as we've heard from the government's top medical advisors, is it may be, which would be the terrible outcome that nobody wants to happen, but it may be that this variant is able to get around the vaccine. And at this stage, people can't be sure that's not the case.
Well, in the SAGE documents that I referenced just a moment ago, it says it is important to be prepared for a potentially very significant wave of infections with associated hospitalisations now ahead of data being available. So there'll be questions about whether the government is being too slow to respond and putting all of its faith into the booster programme. Is that why Boris Johnson is contradicting some of his key advisers, like Jenny Harries, who yesterday was actually cautioning against socialising too much?
Well, the point that you read out from the note there was be prepared. And, of course, the NHS is going to be prepared. And, look, I mean, Jenny Harries gave her advice, and obviously we respect her and the advice she gives. But we have to, the government has to balance. The government has to balance a range of considerations, which include, as Laura said a second ago, economic considerations, social considerations, the impact on people's mental health. And we do have to strike a balance. We need to accelerate the booster programme, introduce proportionate measures like mask wearing in retail, introduce the 2-day PCR test coming in, expand the red list. A huge number of steps have been taken, but in a proportionate way. And Parliament did back those, including the Labour Party, overwhelmingly. No one is saying these decisions are easy. And of course, with hindsight, from one perspective or the other, they can be criticised. Keir Starmer has spent the last 2 years criticising with the benefit of hindsight. But I think this does strike the right balance, but we'll keep it under careful review, and if changes are needed, they'll be made.
Alison, I mean, there is an accusation, certainly from the hospitality industry, that already talk of the variant and its impact is, to some extent, leading to cancellations across the board, that the sort of mental health issues, if people fear that they might be locked down in any way, UK are coming back. Do you think you are sort of trigger happy when it comes to asking for restrictions, asking for Plan B, saying the government should tell people to stay at home if they can when they're working?
No, I don't. And it's all very well talking, about what the Labour Party are doing, and Chris is keen to, explain that we voted for the restrictions. Yes, we did. My criticism of the government is not that this is wrong, it's that we need to be bothered about our borders and getting people a test before they get to the border so that they're safe and secure, and also be bothered about what's going on beyond our borders. As Laura said, the reason why this is a problem is because we've got the kind of mutation here that nobody wanted to see. All the different parts of the virus that are the worst look like they're together in this variation. That's because of what's going on in poor countries with insufficient healthcare systems. So that's why we need UK leadership, not just in sorting out our borders, but what's going on in countries beyond our borders, and doing what we can to make sure that we see this virus as a global problem, not just something for us in the UK.
A brief response and we'll move on.
Look, we've played our part internationally. I've mentioned our huge support for the COVAX scheme and vaccines. We've donated tens and tens of millions of vaccines, and we funded the invention of the AstraZeneca vaccine right here in the United Kingdom. If we'd listened to Keir Starmer's advice, Captain Hindsight, we would have frankly been in lockdown. We'd have been in lockdown the entire year.
Repeating the nicknames.
We'd have been
That's a great
in
argument.
lockdown the entire year, and our economy and society would have been decimated.
All right, well, let's talk about Keir Starmer, because he carried out a very significant reshuffle this week. I just want to show you this picture because of the juxtaposition of Keir Starmer and some of his front bench team over the top of Look Left, whereas we had guests on the programme the last 2 days saying exactly the opposite. This is a team that's looking right rather than left. It was slightly chaotic, the reshuffle, to say the least. It sort of happened while we were on the programme, except the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, didn't seem to know about it, or certainly didn't say she knew about it. Was it a misfire?
No, I don't think so at all. I agreed with Rebecca Long-Bailey before when she said that she tries not to pay too much attention until it's done.
I wasn't sure I believed her on that.
No, well, I think it's by far and away the most sensible approach. But I think everybody's really glad to have Yvette back on the front bench.
As the Shadow Home Secretary.
She's been an incredible Select Committee chair, and I think it will be great to see her at the dispatch box.
Right, I mean, he said, and in fact Jenny Chapman, another one of your colleagues, said that this is a team that will be better equipped to take the fight to the Conservatives. Is that an admission that Labour haven't quite made the inroads they should have done, especially over the last few weeks when there have been all these allegations of sleaze?
2019 was a humbling experience for us all, and nobody wants to be in this position anymore where we're losing vote after vote in the House of Commons. So we all know what the challenge is, and we relish it. I think that we need to be absolutely focused on where the country, where we want to be in a few years' time. This virus has been horrendous, but I want a country where kids in school get a proper chance to take part in all of the things that make life good. That's some of the things that Keir has set out, and I think that's where our eyes are now, on those families up and down the country who want our lives to be better and more enjoyable. That's where we want to deliver.
One of the other things that Rebecca Long-Bailey said just before Prime Minister's questions is the importance of unity in the party. You will know that the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, and others on that wing of the Labour Party have said this is a sort of Blairite revival. Do you think Keir Starmer has deliberately dropped that whole idea of unity, cutting the left?
In my experience, winning elections is quite good for unity. I think winning elections tends to bring people together, so I would say eyes on the prize. When it comes to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they won 3 and were an incredible team, but both of them always taught me, look forward, look ahead, don't look back, and that's what we're doing.
I think it would be interesting to remind anyone who was actually around covering politics in that era that Yvette Cooper was somehow a Blairite. That's not quite how I remember things from those very tense days when Alison says everyone was looking forward. There was quite a lot of looking next door between 10 and 11 as well at the time.
But for the future of the country, they always had their eyes front, and that is what we need to be doing now.
This also reminds me of, and our viewers may remember, during the Labour Party conference, we asked Keir Starmer a very direct question: what's more important to you, unity or winning? Because remember, during the campaign, his leadership campaign, he was all about unity, all about pulling people together. Without any hesitation, he's winning. Of course, winning is much more important than unity. And I think that's this is what we saw this week is partly evidence of that position that he feels now more able to take, because he has more grip of his party now. He's been through a very, very difficult first year. But I think that this is, his supporters would say, a sort of sign actually of his kind of confidence to move people around, less unafraid of what the consequences might be. And actually, I think most of the moves were pretty straightforward calculations of getting better performers into more high-profile roles for the party. Now, yes, I also think that it's a bit of maybe a small shuffle a little bit towards the right, but I don't think in any way, looking at that lineup, you can say it's a dramatic reinvention of what Keir Starmer stood for. And I think mainly it's about sort of competence, and it's like the reshuffle. I'm not the first person to say this, but I think it's the kind of team he might have liked to put together a year ago, but the political circumstances dictated that maybe wasn't possible.
What about tension, though, at the top between Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the deputy leader? Does Keir Starmer need to work a little harder at making sure his deputy leader is included?
Well, Angela did a fantastic interview in Grazia magazine this week where she was talking about getting him to buy her some pork scratchings when he took her to his local. So I don't think things are that bad.
Right.
I think the truth is, as I said before, we are focused on winning, and that does tend to bring people together because it has been a punishing time to be in the Labour Party, losing vote after vote in the House of Commons, and it can't go on.
No, there is something of a sort of drama between the two, and references talking of frivolous questions about parties, the fact that Angela Rayner hasn't been invited to the Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves Shadow Chancellors.
Well, it's been hosted by Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, which is an interesting thing if you are looking for signs in the Westminster Social Diary of where things are, which it does tell you something. I think the interesting reason why this does actually matter is that the deputy leader position in the Labour Party is always quite an interesting role because they have their own mandate. So she's an elected deputy leader with her own power, her own connection with the base, particularly in Angela Rayner's case, her own relationships with the unions. But that also means that, as an important voice in the party, Keir Starmer can't hire and fire her in the way that he could other members of the shadow cabinet. I'm told that things had been better between their two teams of late. She was plainly very irritated by how things unfolded on Monday morning. But the bigger picture is, of course, what the new top team looks like and the voices and messages that our viewers are going to hear from Labour in the next few years.
I respect Laura's analysis, right, and her right to do that.
There's a but coming, Alison. I can hear it.
It's a massive but. It's a massive but that I am absolutely confident, having worked with her for years, that none of that matters more to Angela Rayner than what's going on in social care and getting care workers a pay rise, which is what we're about. All of this is very interesting, but none of it matters more than what we actually want a Labour government for.
All right, well, let's talk about something else, because I feel, Chris, you haven't been included into this discussion, even if you'd like to be. Look, we've had this urgent question on Storm Arwin, and some of the headlines, over 95% of those affected by Storm have power now restored. Still 30,000, that's of 8 o'clock this morning today, without power. They should get it restored in the next day or two, but I think that will take it up to nearly 6 days without power. That is pretty awful, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the Minister, I think Greg Hands, has been on the ground looking at what's going on, making sure all of our national resources are being brought to bear to fix these issues. Clearly, it was a very serious storm. It caused very widespread devastation. I think the fact the Minister is there on the ground, making sure things are getting fixed, says a great deal about the amount of attention this really important issue is getting.
Is it good enough for people? And, you know, pensioners and families have been freezing in their homes for 5-6 days. Is that good enough?
Clearly any period of time without power is bad news, particularly in late November or early December. But the Minister's been there personally. All the resources are being brought to bear, and the power supply issues that the devastating storm caused, it sounds like are pretty much behind us, which is obviously very welcome news indeed.
Right, well, as you say, we'll bring any developments on those final 30,000 or so people still today without power.
Not all of them could cram into the Tan Hill pub at the top of the Yorkshire Moors.
Yes. No, unfortunately, for 3 days for that lock-in. Talking of something else that people might be doing, which is voting in a by-election, which is happening tomorrow.
Indeed, it is, and it feels a strange time of year to come about, but it should, in theory, be a very, very safe Conservative seat. Old Bexley and Sidcup. The chatter around is that the Reform Party, you may remember them, a sort of successor to the Brexit Party run by Richard Tice, who's no stranger to this programme, they kind of believe they may be able to make some inroads, but there isn't a suggestion at this stage that it will be the kind of upset that we saw, our viewers might remember, in Chesham and Abersham, where the Lib Dems managed to overturn another really hefty Tory majority.
Right, and I'm just going to put up here the list of candidates, which you will be able to see, and any more details, no doubt, on the BBC website. There it is, Old Bexley and Sidcup by-election. Also a statement on the social care white paper this afternoon. We will try and perhaps catch up with that tomorrow. But up until then, thanks to all of my guests today. It's all we have time for, and I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live. Bye-bye.